Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that masterpiece known as Godzilla, Mothra and King Ghidorah, giant monsters all -out attack! On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, or as I prefer to go by, Thomas, Mothra and King Ghidorah, giant monsters all -out attack. That's my
podcast all out attack.
That's my Christian name, God given.
Oh, hello, I'm Bryan, and it's like a monster convention in here. Line really tickled me.
Yes. Well, we're here, Bryan, at our penultimate episode for the Godzilla season. We've gone through quite a journey, as we now are at the Millennium Era. We did a bit of, wonky time displacement and whatnot, going from our C for classic to 2 of the newer Godzilla movies, but now we kind of caught up as we discussed, like I said, the Millennium Era, which, if you don't know out there, Godzilla basically is divided into a few eras over in Japan. You got the Showa era, the classic movies. You got the Heisei era, which was in the 80s and 90s. And then the Millennium Era, very appropriately, at the dawn of the new millennium. I'm curious, Bryan, you haven't, unlike with previous episodes, you haven't gone through, all of the Millennium Era movies. But how do you feel about the ones, starting with Godzilla 2000 and forward in Japan, from what you've seen?
Right, yeah, I've only seen the first 4, just didn't have time to do the other 2, but I'll be doing those after we finish this, probably, within the next couple days. Yeah, I was really curious to get into these, because I was really pleasantly surprised by how great a lot of the Heisei era movies were, and at least how interesting they were, even the ones I kind of don't like as much, like Destroya, still has a lot of good elements, so I was very curious to see how they would kind of, adapt Godzilla into the new millennium, and it does get off to a rocky start with Godzilla 2000, which, kind of sucks, actually. I love just the idea of, especially putting 2000 at the end of a title, to signify,
right.
It's the new millennium, we're gonna do a modern take on this. But that movie's very bad, unfortunately, which kind of sucks, because, I like that they are still, like in the Heisei era, these movies feel very of their time. They feel very 2000s, very early 2000s, and
Yeah.
especially with, Godzilla 2000 attempts a lot of CGI, which kind of makes sense. It's the new millennium, new visual effects, all that stuff. And in Godzilla 2000, it straight up doesn't work at all, and there's too much of it. But I think as it kind of goes on, and as I've, gone into the next Millennium movies, I think they've really found their place and found a nice kind of balance between that kind of classic guy in suit kind of visual effects that they kind of mastered throughout, the Showa and Heisei era, and the new, CGI, and using a new technology to kind of make it look more interesting and make it look modern and all that stuff. So it's a really interesting era, and it kind of, weirdly enough, picks up right where the Heisei era is, right? Because, of course, the kind of dividing line between the Heisei era and the Millennium Era is the Roland Emmerich movie, which I know you like slightly better. You don't like that movie, but I despise it.
Don't fucking spread rumors out here. How dare you?
It's libel.
I will sue. But that's an important thing with the Millennium Era, because, with the Heisei era, you mentioned versus Destroya, that's a very definitive, ending in a lot of ways. Right. That movie's very much, it was around the time of, the 40th anniversary of Godzilla, and it felt like they were kind of like, you know what, let's put Godzilla to rest for a bit. Let's put him on ice, and we'll come back to him.
Put him down.
And that's 95. And then 98, the Godzilla TriStar movie comes out.
Right.
And isn't very well liked, to be very, like, mild about it. Definitely the first Godzilla movie I ever saw in the theater. I remember very distinctly. Like, I was cognizant for at least, like, the sort of marketing campaign for that.
Sure. Size does matter.
Size does matter. His foot is bigger than this bus.
Right.
Yep. He had a whole back and forth with the Taco Bell dog, Bryan.
Oh. What?
He's like, yo, Kira, Godzilla. And shit.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and all that stuff. And I don't know, I remember at the time when I was a kid, I just liked it just because it's like, oh, it's a big monster and whatnot.
Sure.
And then I kind of fell into the whole, like, oh, this is, like, the worst movie ever per the internet. That was one of the earliest examples I can think of, like, people, like, finding a movie, like, this is our enemy, and we will shoot all of our missiles at it and destroy it. And I think that's kind of why when I revisited it around the time I was going through, like, these Millennium Era movies, I was just like, well, I might as well. I haven't seen this movie in so long.
Right.
I'll say, I think it might just be because late 90s blockbuster trash, at the very least, has more tactility to it than modern blockbuster trash. There's still models. There's still, like, some, practical bits of Godzilla. He's mostly CG, obviously, which that CG does not hold up at all whatsoever.
So bad.
No.
And also,
no.
I hate his redesign. It just doesn't look like Godzilla at all. Like, yeah, and it is really interesting, I think, especially that movie. I was reading a bit about, like, the production history of that movie, and they basically try to make it for the majority of, like, while the Heisei era is going on. It's like TriStar trying to get, like, a movie made of Godzilla, and they just can't do it, and they do it right after the end of the Heisei era, and it kind of prompts Toho to be like, fuck, well, we have to bring this back because
That's the thing. So they saw that movie and they're like, hold on, okay, because Godzilla 2000 actually comes out in 99, and I believe it's, like, not more than a year after that. They were just like, which might explain how rushed that movie is.
I was gonna say, yeah.
And to be fair, I would say, because I didn't rewatch all the Millennium movies in prep for this, but I think that one and Mecha the second Millennium movie, they blend together a lot for me. Like, I think the only distinctive sequences I really remember from either is in 2000, there's the bit with the tunnel, which I think is pretty cool, where the car's going down the tunnel, like, Godzilla, like, shows up at the end of it. It's one of the first, like, really interesting perspective bits that they do in the Millennium Era, which we'll definitely talk about with this movie. A lot of interesting, like, human perspective shots and stuff. But and then Mecha I believe, is the one where Godzilla does his weird, like, computerized belly flop, where he's just, like, kind of like onto, like, Mecha that shot of, like, this looking up at the sun and shit like that. Yeah, but I don't know, those two kind of, like, bleed together a bit for me. In a way, because it feels like another thing with the Millennium period we should mention is, unlike the Heisei era, or even the Showa era to a certain extent, always kind of rebooting itself, really.
Right.
Because Godzilla 2000 is a reboot, and then Mecha is also a reboot. GMK is also a reboot, which we'll be talking about today. And even, like, Against Mechagodzilla is kind of a reboot, and then, spoilers, Tokyo SOS is a direct sequel. Which also just feels weird. Like, wait, this is when we're doing a direct sequel now.
Sure, right, yeah.
Right. And Final Wars is kind of like a reboot, but also all of it counts, which is really weird because every monster shows up in that movie. Or just like, yeah, the 54 thing happened and all these other monsters exist, but not all these adventures maybe happened. I don't know. It's weird. It's 50 years, guys. We're just going to bring everybody back. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, it also is very interesting to note that this is kind of, right, like, Final Wars is, like, the 50th anniversary of Godzilla. And so it is interesting the way that they have kind of, all these movies kind of feel almost like a Godzilla celebration, almost, of kind of a lot of disparate, but kind of some of the best elements of Godzilla, like, especially this movie, which, like, features kind of the three big kaiju of the Godzilla franchise, and, like, Against Mechagodzilla brings Mechagodzilla back and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's a really interesting kind of almost celebration round for Godzilla at his 50th anniversary.
To show, like, you know, a guy in his middle age can still, like, get up and do it, you know?
Right, yeah.
I'm sure Godzilla was in his, like, underwater, like, retirement in the, like, late 90s. Like, all right, I'll see what the new guy is. Like, oh, God, Toho, hello. We gotta get something going. This is bullshit. I don't care if I'm like 45. We're going back into this.
Yeah, I mean that's why they had to use a lot of CGI for 2000 because he's older. You know, he can't do all the stunts himself.
That's true. Though, interestingly, a big thing with the Millennium Era is, aside from this movie GMK and Final Wars, pretty much the same suit the whole time. They differentiate some things. Like, I forget which one it is, 2000 or Mechaguirus, has, like, the most absurd dorsal fin things for him on the back. Like, they're massive. Like, he could, like, take one of them off and, like, stab Mechaguirus with it and just, like, fucking cut his throat with one of those things. But it mostly is, like, the same design throughout most of the Millennium Era, which is unlike Heisei kind of changes it up a bit, and Showa has like a huge variety of looks.
I love his design in this movie. We'll get into it a bit, but I like that the way that they kind of treat. I think we've talked about this in previous episodes, this miniseries, but like I like the way that they are kind of like pick and choose what continuity matters or what canon matters, right? And I like that sort of just loose logic to it of like, yeah, some of it matters. The 54 one matters in this one, but not in this one. I don't know. I just like that for kind of the variety's sake. I think it's a really interesting way of doing things.
Especially after the Heisei era, where you had like Miki occur throughout most of those movies and stuff like that. It is definitely like, not necessarily a breath of fresh air, but it definitely feels like, okay, if we're gonna do this, we're not just gonna do the Heisei era stuff. Mm-hmm. We're gonna kind of like experiment, do wild things, which is definitely the case with our main feature for today. So we'll go ahead and play the trailer here for Godzilla, Mothra and King Ghidorah, giant monsters all -out attack.
千年竜王
東国聖樹伝記によると日本には古来バラゴン、モスラ、ギドラなどの怪獣がいてゴジラ発見三大怪獣ついに激突
キングギドラ
生き残るのは誰だゴジラ、モスラ、キングギドラ大怪獣総攻撃
So, Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, giant monsters all -out attack, came out December 15th, 2001 in Japan, directed by Suzuki Kaneko, who I want to point out a bit because there's an interesting kind of wrinkle to him in that this is the only Godzilla movie he worked on, but notably, he worked on a trilogy of kaiju films starring Gamera, who is Godzilla's kind of counterpart. The turtle guy. Are you aware of Gamera at all?
I've heard of him, and I know that he is kind of one of those big kaiju figures. I don't think I know what he looks.
He's like a big turtle. He looks like a snapping turtle.
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
Yeah. Right. Admittedly, I haven't seen any Gamera myself. I know they ran parallel to Godzilla because it's a different studio. Notably, for a while I was even like, why haven't Gamera and Godzilla crossed over? It's like, oh, it's two different studios. It's like Marvel, DC kind of deal.
Right.
Like, most of my knowledge of Gamera honestly comes from clips of Mystery Science Theater 3000, where they did a bunch of the Gamera movies. I haven't seen, like, those full episodes because I write stuff, but I've seen plenty of clips, particularly of them doing their own lyrics for the Gamera song, which is like, Gamera is really neat, he is filled with turtle meat, we all love you, Gamera, and shit like that. So, point is, in the 90s, Mr. Kaneko did 3 Gamera movies that I've heard are very, like, good. I've heard from a lot of people who sort of, like, have watched the Gamera movies, so those are, like, the 3 kind of, like, essential ones of recent era. Because I know there hasn't been, like, as many Gameras. There was, like, a bunch in the 60s and 70s, those 3 in the 90s, and I think 1 in 2006, and then he's been kind of dormant for a bit, except for, I think they did, like, an animated show recently on Netflix.
That sounds right. That sounds like something they would do.
And I've heard to some degree that this one, GMK, which I guess we'll call it for the sake of brevity, though I think it's only fair, Brian, I've said it a couple times, you need to say the full title, exactly as I said it.
It's such a great title.
Yes.
I love super long titles. I love titles with, like, punctuation. It's just, Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah.
You're forgetting the punctuation, sir.
I am.
You gotta pronounce
Godzilla,
the punctuation.
Mothra. No Oxford, comma. I disagree with that,
No.
by the way. And King Ghidorah, giant monsters, all out hyphenated, attack. And the title card drop in this movie is incredible.
Yes.
Especially with how long the title is and how long it kind of like, it just does like Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, and then it does the rest of the title. It's so great.
By the way, also very notable in that the version at least that we watch, we should note that like with the Millennium Era, mostly what's available on streaming services is the English dubs.
Yeah.
I don't think they're bad dubs though necessarily. I think particularly GMK is like a solid dub, I would say. And from what I remember, at least I've seen the Japanese version of this. Not too different. Not a lot of like differences necessarily.
Yeah, it's not a bad dub by any means. I just have a kind of really low tolerance for English dubs of anything Japanese. I can't sit there and listen to the way that some of these like American people say like a lot of these Japanese names. It just like really kind of, gets to me.
There's more of a charm, I would say, with like the Showa era dubs, where it's a bit more
right.
lo-fi. And trivia, and especially I believe it's King of the Monsters, one of the early jobs for Mr. Sulu himself, George Takei.
Interesting.
Yes. Oh my. Yes. So yeah, but obviously the GMK is what we had, but in the dub that was put out, they also have subtitles for like any of like the Japanese lettering, including the title. And I love in the title, it's I believe it's Godzilla and Mothra have a like circle C inside of it, like right next to it, like for copyright, like a little circle in the C. And then, but then King Ghidorah has a TM, which is where like he's trademarked. Like Godzilla and Mothra are like bigger dogs. They need like the C copyright notice.
Oh, that's really great, actually.
It's pretty great. But anyway, so for brevity, we'll call it GMK. That's what a lot of people call it. That makes more sense.
I'm trying to see what the like GMKG GMAOA.
So like I said, this one I've heard a lot of people say it kind of feels a bit closer to like a Gamera movie, which those are more intended for like younger audiences. Gamera is friend to children, as they often say apparently in those movies. But it's interesting how with this one there's a bit of that sensibility. I think there is kind of like an interesting kind of like goofiness at some points to this. But also the movie's dealing with very heavy themes, as we'll get into. Sort of Godzilla's newer origins in this are a bit more grounded in a way that's fascinating. But at the same time, I think why I've been saying, like in the lead up to this, I've even told you, like when we were going to do this, my absolute favorite of these movies is GMK. Of like the 40 different fucking Godzilla movies I've seen. And I think it's because with the weird kind of playful tone of especially the monster stuff, but then also the gravity of like a lot of the implications for like Japan as a culture, especially with Godzilla in this case, I think it does such a fascinating job of like balancing those disparate tones in a way that makes it kind of like, to me, a great smorgasbord of everything I love about the character and this universe and like kaiju in general. But so I'm curious, going into it with like those high like sort of marks for me, how'd you end up feeling about GMK?
Yeah, I loved this movie. I really loved it, and I've liked most of them of these Godzilla movies, and even the ones that are kind of like just okay have a lot of redeeming qualities to them, and I really like a lot of elements of ones that I may not even love that. Even like Megaguirus, there's kind of some elements I like about it, and it's still like with almost any of the Godzilla movies, by the time the monsters start fighting, I'm like, this is great. I'm having a good time. Like, this is fun. But yeah, this movie it's kind of a dark movie in a lot of ways. It's kind of like, there's certain like kind of small moments in this that are very disturbing in a lot of ways and very dark. And yet, yeah, they've retained a lot of the kind of lighter touch that a lot of those Heisei movies have, especially when it comes to like the monster stuff, and they are still like, for the most part at least, rubber suits kind of fighting each other and like biting each other's like necks and stuff like that. But like, I agree with you though, like this does contain, I think, so much of what I love about Godzilla. I don't know, it feels very complete, and it does feel like, because one of the things I love about watching all of these movies is their variety, and also, like I mentioned, just the idea of this kind of loose continuity. We're not really sticking to like a strict, like, each one is a sequel of the other one kind of. But this movie really feels like it has a certain vision behind it, especially in its messaging and kind of how it has that kind of the weightier tones that it has. By the time it really gets going into the kind of monster fighting, in really the last like half of this movie is kind of a huge set piece almost. It's so incredible and really gets like a lot of the scale, and with a lot of the like visual effects that you mentioned earlier, like a lot of those perspective shots and stuff like that. Yeah, I love it, and I love it also as just this like having the three kind of monster, right? Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah. I think it's such a great kind of trifecta to have all three of those in a movie.
Well, no disservice to a fourth monster, our boy Baragon.
Hey, we'll get to Baragon. I like
who doesn't get billing though. I think unfair. I think you could have fit Baragon.
They could have put him in like the fine print, like and Baragon at the bottom.
Featuring like FT
featuring Baragon.
Baragon. At the very end is all monsters like featuring Baragon.
Yeah, but I think we were talking when we did the Godzilla X Kong episode, and we were talking about King of the Monsters, the 2019 movie, and I think we both talked about how kind of bummed we were that movie just isn't as good as it could be, because it would be so cool to get a big, especially Hollywood with that kind of size budget, version of these kind of monsters. And this is kind of what I wanted from that movie, right? Like just having those three monsters, having them fight. This is kind of what I wanted from something like King of the Monsters, the 2019 movie. But it's just so much better.
For sure, yeah. Let's do a bit of a plot synopsis, at least of this one, at least a brief premise set up here, because I think this one might be a bit more obscure to people. We definitely both would recommend like watching this movie before you listen to this.
Yeah.
Because we're definitely going to talk about a lot of details about it. But basically, GMK, like we mentioned, kind of a reboot. They reference that like the 1954 attack happened. So the first movie is still pretty much canon, though some things, as they kind of reveal later, are not quite. Like, they don't reference the Oxygen Destroyer, really. They just kind of reference that, like, the original attack happened and Godzilla kind of disappeared despite military attempts at attacking him. None of that stuff worked. He just left. And then this movie starts off with, like, we're noticing some weird disturbances underwater, and we have this whole thing led by Admiral Taizo Tachibana, played by Ryudo Ozaki, who is this kind of military leader who, as we find out later, was there for the original Godzilla attack and lost his parents at that point. When he was a small child. But they're looking around at like this sort of like destroyed husk of a ship, and they're like, okay, what's going on here? Because we see that, all this destroyed stuff, and then we see Godzilla's little fucking dorsal fin moving around the water.
That shot is so great.
It's a great kind of Jaws shot, but at the same time, it doesn't feel as Jaws heavy as much. It's just like, oh shit, that's Godzilla. But like, you can already tell from just that shot of his dorsal fin that like, this is a different Godzilla somehow. This is like a more sinister creature just by like a shot of its back.
Yes, and just the way his back is glowing, you just see like it's very ominous, and yeah, it's such a great kind of like sort of introduction to this character, kind of tease of this character.
Which leads right into like the title drop you talked about, which is kind of perfect. It's like, I think it might be Godzilla, whatever.
And the music in this movie is incredible. It's the score composed by Koa Otani. It's really interesting because it isn't like the Ifukube score, really, and not like a lot of his scores. It's a lot more like electronic and really kind of like fulfills that promise of like, it's the new millennium. We can have a new modern take on this. And the music really reinforces that with how just like electronic it is, how great it is. It's a really great use of the Ifukube score, which they do use, but
particularly for the ending shot, I think it's a really good choice to have that there, right? But it is definitely, but it is definitely this very different kind of tone where it is kind of like there's an electronicness to it. There's also just like an intensity, which I think really works for this movie, because the big thing with Godzilla in this is that he is this still an upsetting force, but at the same time, Godzilla, I think more so in this movie than even some of his like nastier villain appearances, he is such a fucking like malignant, awful menace. Yes. He truly is just like, he's spiteful at certain points, I think, as we'll get into. Just like, oh man, he's not fucking right. He's being mean.
Yeah. Well, his eyes, man. Like, that's such a like great way to indicate like that this is a like malicious force. And I love the way his eyes just look so unsettling every time that they cut to like a close-up of him.
We should note the reason is because he does not have pupils. This is the first Godzilla where it's a white, vacant eye. But also even like his kind of like brow and his like little like bags underneath are like very animated in a way where it's just he kind of like is like seething, like kind of looking at you with squinted eyes, and then like opening up, which is like, oh, I get to be an asshole. And
just the all white eyes really just kind of makes it feel like he is in this like frenzy, you know, like he's a monster on a like, you know, rage frenzy or whatever. It is such a great kind of piece of simple and kind of small design, but it really makes a difference.
But anyway, we got a bit off the plot synopsis thing. So basically, like, while this is all going on and like, oh, there seems to be some kind of Godzilla attack and like the military is kind of investigating it, at the same time we have Taizo's daughter, Yori, played by Chicharu Yoyama, who is a journalist at a job that's basically like almost like supernatural tabloid journalism.
Yeah,
basically. It's not quite big. It's a smaller news station, but like they say at the opening, like, oh, we're trying to film on the sacred ground and we have a permit. And the people try and come over and like stop them, just like, hey, what are you doing? Like, we have a permit, and plus, like, we sell the fact that this is like kind of ghosted. Like, they throw a rock into the water. It's like, oh, what's that? To indicate like, oh, there's maybe some kind of ghostly activity. And it's like, look, it's a docudrama, whatever. Plus, we'll drive tourists here. And the guys pause and they're like, well, we do like money. It does sound interesting. And
then he's like, oh, sweetie, like just keep filming. It's okay. Like he really turns like it's very Blair Witchy, the kind of intro with her like doing the kind of documentary thing, which I love, you know, because a lot of these movies with their characters, they tend to do a lot of like they're journalists or they're involved with like the military, they're reporters, kind of stuff like that. And I think it is such a smart way of doing this character where like she is a reporter and she's clearly like knows her shit and kind of, you know, but I love that she works for this like junky, like, you know, like news outlet. But I love her boss too. We'll get to like her boss and just all the crew, like her colleagues and stuff. But it's such an interesting way of kind of updating that idea of like having a reporter character. Yeah,
I mean, Yuri is one of my favorite protagonists in any of these movies, I think, because you really get a full sense of like her arc that we're talking about, which like she wants to be an actual journalist. She thinks that there's like a real power in reporting, while her compadres are like, whatever, it's a job. We want to film stuff or whatever, or get the scoop. They'll like get us like hits and internet connection, which I do love. They have to specifically reference like put up the cameras and also bring an internet connection so we can have Godzilla on the net.
Oh, so good.
It's a lot of that kind of like turn the Millennium Internet stuff.
I love all of the especially the early 2000s like tech that is in this movie, all like the monitors and consoles that they have in the military sections. I love all that stuff. Honestly, could have used more of it. It's my favorite part of like a lot of those Heisei movies. But yeah, I love her character like so much, and I think I love like the scene early on where she's like drunk, and like the guy like brings her home, and to her like her and her dad have this interaction where he's like, "You're drunk again," and she's like, "No, I'm not." And then like the next day they have this really sweet interaction where she's just like, "Yeah, sorry, I was really like messed up," like. And
he's like, no worries, it's fine. You have like you went out and like had some fun, but you gotta be responsible. It's a genuine like father-daughter, especially like an adult father-daughter relationship.
Yes,
where it seems like she's kind of like on hard times. It seems like she's living with him, but at the same time, there's a real like sincerity and earnestness, like you're mentioning. They both apologize in their own right. You can tell it's just like, he raised her right, and that there is like a true like love and a respect and a connection. But at the same time, they do just kind of a divergence with, like, Godzilla, you know? Just, like, really breaking families apart. His most malicious act, beyond killing hundreds of thousands of people, is really just breaking up this small family.
What is he, a divorce attorney or something?
Are you getting divorced? Call 555 Godzilla.
Oh, man.
This has all happened, like, Yuri's doing some investigation stuff around, like, these, like, this holy land of sorts. That's in the mountains. And While she's there, she reads up a bit more about, like, oh, not only is, like, Godzilla a factor, because I like in this movie how they really establish, like, oh, since it's been almost 50 years, most people don't really know what Godzilla is. They kind of, like, vaguely are aware.
Yes.
He's, like,
Oh,
a
man.
past thing. But you have, like, her investigating around, finding out about this thing called guardian monsters. While at the same time, you also have some different groups of, especially, like, just young teens being ruffians.
Oh my god, those fucking
Fucking
man.
Those rapscallions, get off my lawn, etc.
Yeah, like, look, whenever, like, there's some, like, really violent stuff that happens to, like, a lot of, like, just normal, innocent people later on in the movie, but, like, those fucking kids who, like, are gonna drown an adorable Shiba Inu.
Yes,
Yeah,
they
I'm
do
so
literally say
happy.
just like, oh, that dog's annoying, let's throw him into the river. Just like, wow.
Cutest dog I've ever seen in my life. Yeah, I'm so happy that they died, and it is such a fun, like, very Jaws as well, like the way they get, like, pulled down into the water.
By, of course, Larva Mothra,
Right.
which is
again,
where she shows up. Yes.
I love, again, the way that they revert her back to a larva state sometimes. Sometimes she's just straight up Mothra. I love that stuff.
Right, yes. And they basically reveal, like, during Yuri's research that, like, okay, there are 3 guardian monsters who will end up, like, protecting the Earth specifically, which is one of my favorite details about this, that, like, in a lot of, like, other, these movies where it's like, oh, they're protecting Japan. Like, that's a common thing. Like, Godzilla once became a hero. It's like, oh, he's protecting Japan and the people of Japan. I like that our guardian monsters aren't really protecting Japan, the people, as much as just, like, the land. Like, they establish, it's like, it's the mountains and the rivers and everything. Just, like, nature is what's being protected. Humanity's just, like, in the middle of it. Because they just cause shit. It's noticeable how, like, aside from, like, sort of our main 2 characters, a lot of, like, the bumbling stuff that happens is because of human ineptitude, basically. It's a lot of just, like, people doing the wrong things at the wrong time. It adds another fascinating layer to this movie where this could become, in the wrong hands, sort of, like, weirdly nationalistic. Versus this movie is very much kind of taking to task, like, no, you humans, like, really fucked shit up. Like, the main reason Godzilla's here is because of Japan's horrible past, specifically. Yes. So it's a lot of that reckoning, which I find, like, makes us, once again, like, some of the darker themes that this is all, like, coming from, like, so fascinating.
They have this kind of, like, interview scene with, like, the old guy. I forget his name, but...
Oh, he's so great, the old guy.
Yes. And the thing he says, which you kind of mentioned, like, is, like, Japan is forgetting about Godzilla. And it's this really great... It's a great way of doing that because... Also, it's almost the 50th anniversary, so it's like you've been doing this character for so long. It's interesting to kind of have this element of, like, he's this kind of mythic figure of the past, and, like, that was the 50s. Like, this is the modern age of Japan. Just the way that they kind of incorporate all of the themes in this movie it's really great, and really just, I mean, we could talk a little bit about this, but it really reminded me of Godzilla -1 in the way that, like, it is reckoning with Japan's history while also tying that to Godzilla, because Godzilla is such an integral part of Japanese history, especially in after World War II.
By the way, the old man is Mr. Ishiyama, played by Hideo Yamamoto, which I want to talk about him a bit because he's kind of like the last real bit of, like, the sort of plot synopsis to talk about, because, like, they end up discovering him and they learn a lot of this about, like, the guardian monsters and a lot of this from his exposition, but he also maintains that, like, look, Godzilla, like, was partially created by, like, that nuclear event that happened in 54, but the big thing that especially made him rise this time is that he is possessed by the ghosts of the victims that Japan killed during World War II. Specifically, they mentioned the Pacific War, which I just want to say, I apologize if we're not as up on all of our Japanese history. That might have been evident from some of the earlier episodes. We're not experts necessarily. But the Pacific War was specifically, like, before, like, Pearl Harbor, like, where Japan just killed a bunch of, like, American soldiers, but also, like, a lot of Chinese and Filipino soldiers and civilians, where they would, like, essentially hop from island to island and just, like, take no prisoners. Horrible murder of, like, thousands of people. And this is obviously as part of, like, the, conflict with the Allies and stuff like that. And if I'm forgetting any details, go ahead and message us. Tell us that we're wrong. And when I found out that was what this was, because like in the lead up to this, as I've said previously, I watched like the Heisei in the Millennium Era in prep for Godzilla versus Kong coming out in 2021. This one I was like, okay, I'm aware that like he looks different, stands out apparently from a lot of the other ones, but I had no idea about like this Godzilla is basically a vengeful ghost who's out to fucking destroy Japan for all the horrible war atrocities, which is fascinating, and I think is why, like you kind of mentioned this earlier, you can tell that this was such an influence for Takashi Yamazaki in doing Godzilla Minus One.
Right.
He said as much where he said, quote, "I had forgotten the contents of GMK for a while, but it seems like I self-consciously thought about it when I was writing the scenarios for Minus One. Without realizing it, I was under considerable influence from it." And I think that's very clear. If you really liked Godzilla Minus One, definitely see GMK.
For sure.
Yes.
It's weird because they're not similar movies in like the content, right? This movie is very busy. It's big. It's grand. Like Minus One is big, of course, but like has a lot more of an intimate scale. And so it is interesting that they are tied thematically, even though they are very different movies in a lot of respects.
But at the same time, you can still see that influence.
Yes, absolutely.
For sure. Yeah. And I think it's particularly with, like we mentioned, in Godzilla Minus One and with this version of Godzilla here, there is just, like, such true menace with, like, I want to shout out the guy, Mizuho Yoshida, who's in the Godzilla suit for this movie, I think is so wonderful with his body language, where particularly this Godzilla is even more so than a lot of other ones, like, bottom heavy. Like, particularly, there's a lot of shots of, like, his crotch kind of, like, jiggling. And his kind of belly.
His, like, introduction is that, like, really low shot of him, like, looking up. And it's just, like, great at showing just, like, behemoth of a monster. Like, it's a great sort of introduction to this version of Godzilla.
And even the little boat falling, which I could see some people being a bit put off by, like, some of those little digital effect bits. That's, like, a lot of sort of, like, oh, things kind of moving very fast. Like, that happens a lot in the Millennium Era, whereas a lot just, like, oh, a monster will suddenly just kind of, like, slide over digitally and stuff like that. In a way that almost feels kind of anime-y. And I think that's, like, kind of hit or miss, depending on the filmmaker doing it. But in this movie, I think stuff like that, it fits for, like I said, the weird kind of mix of horrible dread over the ghosts of Japan's past coming to haunt them, and, like, I don't know, but he's a big dinosaur guy, right? So just like people are gonna like fall and their ship's like, no, as he's like rising up from the water. Or there's a bit where he's walking around the city by like this one hospital area that's being like evacuated. And there's this one poor woman who's like stuck inside a cast on her leg and she can't move. And she's like, oh my God, is there an earthquake? What's going on? There's a lot of that too, like earthquakes. People kind of like, oh, it looks like it's an earthquake for a second. And then this Godzilla comes stomping by and she is just like, oh my God, is he gonna get me? He doesn't. And he disappears and she's like, oh, thank God. And that motherfucker whips his tail around and just decimates that building.
And he, like, swings it. Like, he literally, like, wha-bam. Like,
right at her floor, too. You can tell that he's just like, he really wants to fuck with her. That's the thing, like, Godzilla is a malicious bully in this movie.
Yeah. He might like those punks who, like, almost drowned the dog. Like, he might be friends with them. He might hire
Fuck
them.
yeah, dude, bro, yeah. But there is that kind of, like, that malicious bully, almost like college frat guy attitude with Godzilla in this movie. That is combined, once again, the souls of all the victims of World War II that Japan killed. Like, mixing that, I think, is so fascinating, but it works so well, particularly with, like, that sequences like that, or there's the bit that where we don't even see, like, Godzilla in full, but this is earlier, after, like, the teenagers fuck with that one idol, and they're, like, in the pool hall or whatever, and, and, like, shit starts, like, oh, like, really great, like, sort of people inside of, like, doing the old Star Trek thing of, like, everyone go to the left, everyone go to the right while the camera moves. But, like, really well done. And you, like, a lot of stuff shaking and shit and people, like, falling over in interesting ways. But that poor dude in the urinal who's just, like, trying to take a piss. And then the earthquake happens. He's, like, covered in piss. He's like, oh, no, this is so...
everywhere. Just go, like,
yeah, just
right,
Right, he's like, oh man, how can this get any worse? And then he looks up like, oh no, and you just see a great shot of zooming out of the window at the basement where he's at.
So
and then an establishing shot of the house, basically, with the little guy like, oh no! And then Godzilla's foot just like, Monty Python foot stomps it. Just flat.
Literally Monty Python. That shot, the shot you talked about of like the zoom out is kind of a perfect example of there's a lot of it that feels very practical. Like obviously, like all those sets are practical, but it is this like kind of thing that you can do with digital technology and CGI of having like, you know, the little guy there and having it zoom out, and you know, it's just one of those things that makes it feel like it still has that analog quality of all the other Godzilla movies before this, or at least the Heisei era ones, but with a lot of that new technology. And I think a lot of it still does look pretty good and holds up quite well. I feel like during the early 2000s, there was this run of incorporating CGI in just the right way, along with analog elements, which I think this movie does really, really well. I was like, you know, because the guy with the urinal, I was just like, you know, it cuts to him, and I'm like, oh no, he's gonna piss everywhere. Like, no, this is the worst time for Godzilla to show up. Like, if I was peeing and Godzilla show up, I would just like, oh, worst timing. And the fact that
let
he
him use his
squished.
zipper, Godzilla. Have his dignity. Like, wash his hands, you know, just like die clean at the very least.
Yeah, and it's funny, but like it's also quite dark, and it's a really weird balancing act that this movie has. Another one I thought of kind of similar to that is when, not nearly as funny necessarily, but just when the guy's in like the business guy in like the suit is in the forest, and he's like about to commit suicide by like hanging himself off the tree.
Oh, yes.
And then he falls like through the ground and finds like the cave where King Ghidorah is like frozen in ice. And again, it's like this movie is weirdly like very dark in that way, where it's like a guy killing himself, but he fails. It's admittedly like a little funny, kind of in a dark way. Yeah, just a lot of moments like that I just find so interesting and unique in this movie.
What really helps it is the fact that like stuff like that feels kind of like cartoony in the way that like older Looney Tunes shorts are cartoony. Right, where it's just like, oh, this like kind of dark joke happens, but it's like pretty funny that like it's happening in this way. But also, I think with the way especially that the monster fights end up being, I think they kind of help exemplify that, where like there are so many like sort of anime moves that Godzilla does in this movie, like particularly during like his Baragon fight. Poor Baragon gets like the shit stomped out of him. It's kind of brutal. It's kind of upsetting, especially because I love the Baragon suit in this movie, because he's got like even more exemplified as like a dog, where he's got like the big floppy ears and his big eyes, little bits and pieces that like make him feel inherently like, oh, he's so adorable. There's that one joke, one of the great kind of like dark lines is like the couple is like watching as Baragon storms by, and they're like, oh, he's so massive but kind of cute. Let's take a picture with him and then we'll flee. And stuff like that. So like, it makes him endearing, and then seeing Godzilla just like stomp that poor little guy.
Yeah, there's the one where he
So
has him
sad.
like laying down, and he's just like curb stomping him like relentlessly, and it is just like, oh, he's already dead. Like,
Right. And you also, I do love the helicopter guys, like the two guys in the helicopter commenting almost like it's a wrestling match. Like, Godzilla's got the red monster in the gravel pits.
I love all the humans as well, because like this monster shows up and they're like, it's Godzilla, because they don't know, they only know about like the sort of like seismic activity. And then one of the guys is like, wait, but Godzilla's not red. And then I also just love later on when like they're sort of all, I think most of the monsters have showed up at this point, and one of the guys, like the little like helpers, is like, do you think we should name all the monsters so we don't get confused? And it's so funny, but also it's like, yeah, they have to like name them so that they can tell who's who.
That's why this feels like truly like such a weird millennial kind of like comedic tone to it, in terms of like, it feels like, oh, I don't know, we're like quote unquote post history, I guess. It's notable, this movie produced pre 9/11, came out post 9/11. It's one of those kind of movies.
Ooh, right.
Which is especially interesting with this one, because it feels like it's one of the last kind of like pre 9/11s, even though obviously Japan and America have very different kind of like cultural elements to it. But there is that kind of like remaining bit of the late 90s thing. Like, we're at the end of history, right? Like, the year 2000 happened, and we haven't experienced anything like massively awful. Which I think only works for like this movie in particular. Feels kind of like, oh, it's the timing of it feels fascinating in terms of like everyone feels like we mentioned with the teenagers, or with the people who were like traveling, just like, oh, I don't know, whatever, like this is like odd, but like it's fine, you know. Once again, post history, like it's just a weird event that's going on,
Right.
And then Godzilla will do stuff like him fucking destroying that mountain, kind of like almost mirroring the mountain shot from the original Gojira, where like pops out his head.
Oh yeah,
and looks down at everybody.
Really great.
But then he takes it one step further of like, oh wait, old me couldn't tear down this mountain. I'm gonna do it, and he just causes an avalanche that kills like that couple I was talking about earlier, and so many tourists. They're just trying to see like the big mountainous Japan.
I mean, I think we talked about this earlier at some point, this miniseries, but like the destruction of like those sets, right? Like just having all those like big sets of like either mountains or cities or whatever.
Yeah.
I can't wrap my head around how they do those destruction sequences. Like with that mountain in particular, like just the way it like crumbles, but especially the city, you know, when we get to like the big battles and like he's destroying all the buildings and everything, it's just like there's something so kind of intricate about it. And yet there is still that kind of analog quality of like they had to build all of these and then just like destroy all of them. It's a really like they're gorgeous sets. I love the miniatures.
I think a part of it honestly is like this kind of unlocked when I rewatched it this time. One of my early exposures to kind of like kaiju related stuff is back in the day on Cartoon Network. They would have these interstitial bumpers that were often like live action or had animated characters interacting with live action elements and stuff. One of the ones I remember the most is that there was a music video they kind of produced in a similar style that was of one of the Powerpuff Girls songs. That was in one of the shows. But there's a bit where the way it's presented is like the Powerpuff Girls are 2D animated, but they're trying to stop in a live action model of Townsville. That giant pufferfish kaiju, who was in one of like the animated episodes of that show, is just attacking the city. And he's doing a full like Godzilla thing. And I think this movie weirdly has kind of the vibe of the model stuff and like Godzilla destroying things. Kind of has that weird sort of live action late 90s, early 2000s like Cartoon Network kind of look in terms of that, where it's like there's a fakeness, but there's also a weird kind of like skyscape. Like I love when we get to like that ending, how there's just like this constant look of like yellow and orange fire like behind these destroyed buildings. It's not actual fire all the time. There's some cool fire stuff that we'll mention, like pyro things, but the whole thing kind of looks like, oh, this actually has been scorched in a way that like they just couldn't do that detail back in the show era, because it's like we build a model city, we're gonna have this guy run through it, and we don't have enough time. Like we'll just see the destruction of this model, as opposed to like seeing the detail of like the post destruction, where it's not just like, oh, this is just man-made. There's detail that just makes it look like Godzilla has almost like eaten buildings in the city.
Yeah,
basically.
It's so incredible, and like, you know, I love a lot of the CGI in like the 2014 one, and -1 has incredible Academy Award winning visual effects. But there is still that element of I miss that kind of analog quality of like building these little miniature sets, and yeah, that kind of quality of like you can tell it's not real, but that does make it kind of better in a way. It makes it feel a bit more fun.
But how would you say this kind of differs in terms of like that effectiveness from like the Heisei era, in terms of not just like the computer elements of it, but like the practical live action stuff? Because there's not a lot of distance between like this and Destroya compared to like the Heisei era and the Showa era, for example. But at the same time, there does feel like, just even on a stylistic level, it feels a bit different. Do you see any kind of reasoning why it's a different besides like the computer effects of it all?
I mean, the computer effects are one thing, and I think, you know, it's clear that they obviously just have like newer technology to do this stuff with. And also I think the fact that they feel bigger, like especially the cityscape sets and the cityscape kind of battles, it feels like they're able to do more with them, where like I love the Heisei stuff, and that of course is like a continuation and a kind of doing more than they did during the show era, of course, but like I love how much bigger all this stuff feels, and how, I don't know, it just is more of that, right? It feels like they've done it before, but now they can just do it much bigger. And also just like you mentioned, the pyrotechnics, they're insane in this movie, and I don't know how no one got hurt or anything, but like all of that too. I think just having like so much fire and just kind of like all the dust and just effects of it all, like really just makes it feel like a bigger, all-out kind of like, you know, thing.
I think aesthetically also it kind of works because like it feels like Godzilla is just bringing hell with him because of his like more supernatural element. He is just kind of like, I will rain hellfire down on all of you. That's what this like. My atomic breath, like, not only does it just like vaporize people, like there's a shot in this movie of like Godzilla using atomic breath on like the model like tanks and stuff. That's even more upsetting than like it would have been in like previous movies, because like he decimates, like they've turned into atoms basically. These tanks.
Yeah, there's something about the way that they've, and I think, yeah, it is because of like advancements in CGI that like I think they can just make it feel a bit more, realistic within like what we've been talking about with all the miniatures and stuff. But like, just when they're like shooting Godzilla, there's like just the effects work whenever like they're shooting like tank shells at him, just looks so good and looks like they're actually like shooting someone with like missiles and just all the fire effects and stuff. And there's so many moments that like the fire effects will just take over the whole screen, like the entire like screen is engulfed in flames, and it just really looks incredible.
One of the big reasons for that is something like, say, Mothra, who we kind of referenced earlier. There's a point where her wings are on fire during that final battle, which fucking rules. She's flying with fucking flaming wings. It's great. But we should kind of mention, like we talked about the Guardian of Monsters element of it, and that Baragon was one of them. But there are two others, the two higher build people, or monsters, kaiju in this one. But that wasn't always going to be the case, because Baragon was always intended to be there. But Kaneko originally, had such interesting ideas. Like, apparently one of his early ideas for this movie was going to be Godzilla facing off against an astronaut who becomes a monster after being exposed to cosmic rays, which would be fascinating.
Weird.
That sounds so cool to me. But then he kind of decided to do like the idea of like, oh, let's split it up into 3 divine kaiju of sorts who have to face off against Godzilla. And Baragon was always going to be a part of that. But the other 2 originally were going to be Anguirus, our cute little, spiky fella, the first monster Godzilla ever fought. And then Varan, who we talked about in our Destroy All Monsters episode, along with Anguirus. Yeah, apparently Toho wanted to do the concept, but said, like, look, Anguirus, Varan, they're not going to get people in seats. Mothra and King Ghidorah, they will totally get people. That's where the money is.
That's
everybody.
Your A-list talent.
That's true. Yeah, it's the equivalent of like, oh, we could have had a movie with like, Steve Buscemi and then 2 smaller character actors, and it's like, no. You gotta get like Goodman, and you gotta get like, fucking, I don't know who's the what's that trio? Is it Jeff Bridges? We just get the Big Lebowski,
right? Yeah,
trio,
yeah.
like the Big Lebowski. For the record, if I could pick one Hollywood star to be a kaiju, John Goodman is kind of like the ideal.
Oh man, he would be great.
Especially, no offense to like him right now in his kind of thinner era, but peak big, fucking John Goodman, like Roseanne era, fucking John Goodman stomping around.
I mean, even Buscemi would be pretty fun. That's like a big kaiju. Come on.
I mean, look, he would make a great Rodan.
It is interesting. I think that like, they were going to go with like Anguirus and Varan, because it's kind of obvious in a way to go with like Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, right? Like those are kind of that's your trio, right? Like the very just iconic, but also just the classic like trio of the kaiju that I think most people know. And I don't know. I'm really curious. I don't know if this movie is as good if you have like Anguirus or Varan, because I love Mothra and King Ghidorah as like just character designs, and I love both of their designs in this movie. Yeah, so I don't know. I just don't know how that would have like worked necessarily.
Yeah, especially considering like the 1-to-1. I don't know if it quite works, because I think Varan would probably be Mothra, because like Varan in his original movie is like based in a lake on this island. Him kind of coming out of the like Mothra coming out of the lake makes sense for Varan. And then Anguirus would have probably been the King Ghidorah, though I guess he would have like kind of come up from the ground, even though Baragon kind of covers that same territory. Because when you kind of think about it, like they're trying to kind of make it like, oh, it's different elements of the Earth kind of coming up. I believe that's what Kaneko's original vision was,
sure.
But doing like those 3 specifically. But yeah, it feels kind of like you want to have at the very least like the trio of having Baragon on all 4s, Mothra flying around the sky, and King Ghidorah actually at Godzilla's sort of height and bipedal.
Right.
I think it's like that's the perfect mix of those three versus you would have two kaiju on four limbs if you had Angus Baragon. Right. I think that trifecta I think just works on a weird thematic level where you just get three different versions of Godzilla just like trying to fight against like one who's lower to the ground, one who's above the ground, and one that's at eye level with him.
Another thing that I think works really well of having these three monsters that we actually have in the movie. Also Baragon. I haven't forgot about him. But
this is Baragon erasure. I'm not gonna fucking stand by it.
Look,
he's such a good boy.
His agent should have pushed to be included in the title.
And he was like, you know what? It's fine. I'll just be like in the regular credits.
Yeah, he just took it uncredited. He's a real. He does it for the art of the kaiju film.
I hear he has an acting studio now. That's why he's not in as much. You know, Toho stopped calling not too long after this movie, unfortunately.
They did, but also he was tweeting some weird stuff, so that also probably got him in some trouble.
Well,
with Toho.
I mean, just some kaiju shouldn't have social media. I keep saying this. He should have a PR team for the Baragon social media accounts. Some kaiju intern writing his tweets. This is very notable for King Ghidorah, classically a villain. Classically, Godzilla in particular is big bad. Mm-hmm. This is the only time in the series that King Ghidorah is treated as technically a hero. Even though, like we mentioned, they're more protecting the Earth. It's not as much about protecting people and whatnot. But how do you feel about that? Because I've heard some people say that's a bridge too far for them in terms of this movie, having King Ghidorah turn good for a movie.
I don't agree with that necessarily. But I do think it is interesting. I think the way that this movie, and really I think the Millennium movies I've seen so far, have treated Godzilla and these other monsters, either they're kaiju, as like menacing creatures, right? Like they are not our friends or our pets. I think they even make a joke about like Godzilla would make a fun pet, like, you know, in this movie, but they don't treat him like that. They still treat him like he is like an enemy. We have to destroy him. We have to, or at least not destroy him, but like, you know, get rid of him somehow. And it's interesting that they still make Godzilla kind of obviously the villain in this movie, but Ghidorah is not really a hero necessarily. You know, he's not like a benevolent force. I like the idea that these monsters they're not helping like the people of Japan, like you said, like they're defending the land, but they're just doing their job. They're not like trying to help, you know, Japan fight off Godzilla. It's a really interesting kind of dynamic. But I love King Ghidorah in this movie. I love his design. I love, you know, when he actually gets to show up and fight, and just his fight with Godzilla is so great. Yeah, I like the way that he is handled in this movie. I don't think he is heroic necessarily, even though he does, like, you know, he is kind of the one who comes in to really help defeat Godzilla. I also just love Ghidorah. He's just such a great design.
And this one's a bit different from the regular sort of designs. I think notably this one, I think kind of has the aesthetic that feels almost a bit more like Jim Henson-y with the kaiju designs of the monsters. There is kind of like, there's a bit more of like a facial expression in particular, because Godzilla classically, even in like these Millennium movies, it's a lot more of just like very basic articulation with the mouth, which is like it'll open up, it's one gear kind of thing. There's not as much room for expression. Versus I think all these monsters have a weird amount of expression. Kind of like a weird thing, because we talked about with the Heisei era last episode, with like those characters feel very toyetic. There is a certain amount of like those feel like action figures. Versus like, if I saw action figures of these Godzillas just like without any context of like what GMK is or whatever, just be like, these are creepy fucking looking action figures.
They're a little creepy.
Like,
yeah.
These are like the Todd McFarlane twisted action figures.
Yeah, like Mothra, like, I love her redesign in this, but like her legs kind of are very creepy and very like bug-like in a way. Like they're kind of longer than they usually are. Yeah, it's a bit kind of, more menacing, but in a way that does feel kind of, like very 2000s of like, it, you know, we can make it grittier, we can make it kind of darker. I would kind of want a like Godzilla toy of like, especially with the white eyes. I think it's such a really great like look.
But also, I think shout out to we kind of mentioned like the title drop, but the title sequence of this movie, where we just have close-ups of the various different parts of the kaiju, like like some of Ghidorah's scales, or a bit of like Mothra's wings, and even like Godzilla's kind of scaliness as well. Baragon, even a bit like his ears and stuff like that. I just like the fact that they really are displaying just like this is all about like the texture of these creatures, which like all these different kaiju movies have had like great textures, but this one, it feels once again unique. It feels kind of just like this isn't quite like your normal Ghidorah or Godzilla or even Mothra kind of like texture. There's something strange.
No, yeah, because like I think we talked about last week about Mothra, like how kind of like fuzzy and kind of like, you know, like felt her like design is in that movie. Like you want like a plushie of her. I wouldn't really want a plushie of this one necessarily. Like it's a lot like bigger of a design. Her like wings are different. It's a lot like more bug-like I said, and yeah, it's an interesting contrast, I think, to like the Heisei design, and still feels like that character doesn't feel like they've just have a different character. It's just kind of what's great about these characters, I think, is that they can be they're very malleable, and they can be cute and kind of fuzzy, or kind of creepy looking, like in this movie.
Truly, yeah. Yeah, so why don't we get back a bit to some of the human stuff, because we kind of talked about these human characters. How do you feel about our Admiral, Tachibana? How do you feel about him especially?
Oh, he's great. His kind of plotline makes me think of obviously -1 because of that connection to like the original Godzilla, and I love the kind of revelation that we find out about him of he was a child during the 54 attack, and he just becomes so much of an interesting character, and especially like I kind of have a problem with the like one general guy who can like, you know, he's risking his life to destroy these monsters, and he's like putting his life on the line. I think that trope is kind of like really played out a lot. But with this, especially because like his daughter is our protagonist, and we find out so much stuff about him that by the time he's like risking his life, I'm just like, fucking go get him, man. Like, just, yeah, like it's really great. I really like his character, and I just also just kind of like his kind of by the end he becomes kind of exasperated of just kind of watching like all these guys in the military, like the war room kind of thing, just kind of fail constantly because like these monsters are just destroying everything, and you can just tell how kind of like frustrating and exasperating it is.
Well, especially when he finds out that, like, oh, this has happened before, where, like, Godzilla's original 54 attack has, I kind of referenced earlier, they don't say the oxygen destroyer, and they just heavily imply that, like, oh, yeah, the government said they killed Godzilla, but they just kind of used their weapons and nothing really worked, and he just kind of went away after a certain point.
Right.
That it was by sheer blind luck of, like, oh, he went away. He probably won't come back, right? We're good, right? He died. Yeah.
I also like that, actually. I like the way that these movies, like, I talked earlier about the kind of loose continuity that these movies have. I really love the way that, like, I forget which one is the one that has the oxygen destroyer again. Like, they bring it back and they build, like, a new one.
Well, I know that Destroyer, the whole thing is like he was born of the oxygen destroyer.
Okay, so maybe it's that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, the way that they kind of, like, some of them will reference the original movie, and some of them will use that as a baseline and kind of be like, okay, that original 54 one happened, this is our story. And I like when they kind of do that. There's a lot of things you can do with that, like this, where you have it be the original 54, the event happened, but Godzilla wasn't killed. Yeah, it's a really interesting way of acknowledging that first movie and its legacy, but kind of wanting to use that for different ideas.
By the way, I apologize. I'm looking at Gojipedia, which is Godzilla, one of, I think, 3 different Godzilla Wikipedias I've used as partial research for this whole season. And it says here that in the continuity of GMK, it is established that the use of the oxygen destroyer against Godzilla was actually a factor, but that was what was kept secret because the military actually failed, which makes more sense, honestly, in retrospect. Yeah. And plus, I think that also works for this, where, like, that kind of fear of nationalism I talked about earlier is really avoided by, like, how we keep talking about how incompetent the military constantly looks. Right. Even during, like, our final, like, later on when it's Godzilla and King Ghidorah fighting underwater, and the one guy shoots and hits Ghidorah, like, incorrectly.
Yes.
And it's like, yeah, I got it. And it's like, no, you fucking moron, wrong one, not the gold one, the green one. You fucking moron. Yeah, just the fact that like all this stuff is happening, like all this like, oh, this military industrial complex is completely crumbling, especially because all this was caused by back in World War II. It just further emphasizes like, oh, the military is like an entire concept is like so bad. Even like when you have two people and one's like our usual military guy, he'll fuck things up, versus having Tachibana involved in this. He definitely feels just like, look, I just want to like do what's actually right here. It's not, it's avoiding, I think, at least being like, oh, one lone like guy going against the system. He's off the force, like kind of thing.
Right.
As opposed to, it just feels more just like, look, I just feel like I have to like finish some fucking shit here, just from all of this baggage that I have and that Japan has. I just gotta get fucking rid of this thing.
Yeah, and I love also that he kind of, obviously because of his connection to his daughter and like what she's going on in her like plot line, like I like when she explains to him about the guardian monsters, and he kind of rightfully so is just like, what are you talking about? What like that doesn't make any sense, that's not real. And then later on when like it's clear that like, oh, that's what's happening here, he's like, oh, it is the guardian monster. Like he comes to that realization, I think in a really kind of genuine way, and in a way that feels kind of realistic for his character.
And then particularly just like such a wonderful moment with him and Yuri, where he just like, I'm gonna give you full press access. Don't mess with her. She can do whatever. Like such a sweet moment where it kind of fits into like, especially Yuri's thing ends up really being kind of like in this world that we mentioned, where like people have forgotten Godzilla. There's a lot of like, oh, history kind of like gets washed away over time as things become peaceful. It's really about her documenting like, no, look, this is happening. Like this is all happening. I want to make sure everyone can see exactly what's going on, because like this is actual crucial information, not just for the now, for giving the news of the moment, but just for documentation purposes. Just really truly saying like, this has happened. It could happen again. We can't forget about it. Right. So especially like her whole speech where she says that essentially with like, so we can like, our children can have a future. Children can have a future and stuff like that. It feels like in a way that could be in the wrong hands once again, kind of like almost after school specialty, but it feels like very earnest and like operatic and massive at the same time that there's like a human connection. There's also that earlier scene with Yuri and the kid.
Yes,
does a great job of kind of like establishing a lot of this.
Yes, and I think, like you said, just that operatic kind of quality of it, of not just the human stuff, but yeah, having the guardian monsters be like, yeah, these guardians of like the earth, just has this really grand quality to it that I think is prevalent in some of the Godzilla movies, but not really in a way like this, where like, you know, it just has this massive scale in terms of not just like literal scale, but just like a temporal scale, right? It's going like, it's about history and how, yeah, like how it repeats itself and how it can't be forgotten. And yeah, just all those elements I think work so well in this movie that is also a really fun monster movie with lots of destruction and just like fun qualities to it. But yeah, it also has a lot of those very dark and also still very, you know, relevant themes. There's a reason why Godzilla has lasted 70 years and continues to be so relevant, I think.
Also a shadow, once again, to Yama, the woman who plays Yuri, is like especially so tactile and has so much agency. Not just in the way this character's written, but also it feels like she's very practical. Like when she's biking, after she picks up that bike, which I love. She's like, oh, I ran out of ones with baskets like hours ago. This will do fine. This will work. And then she just is immediately like storming around with like a camera on her helmet.
I love her like camcorder, like so 2000s, and like because she's like broadcasting from her camcorder, and I love the way that they've incorporated like, you know, 2000s internet, and so it's like lagging, like the feed is lagging when other people are watching it. I also do love her like coworker, who's like constantly like worried about her, and is like seeing her on TV and is like, Yuri, and I love him. He's so cool. Also, her boss is so weird. He's got like the long hair that kind of, there's like a scene where he's like adjusting it as he walks into the room.
Yes,
and it's never acknowledged, but it's like he's got such like wacky hair. He's always like trying to smoke a cigarette but never like quite gets to it. It's great.
All the stuff with like the coworker, I think what really makes that work to me is just the fact that like there's probably some kind of like connection he wants to have with her, but it's very much still like a friendship. Like, you know, it's like, it's practical, it's a work thing. He has a crush on her, but she has like not a lot of interest necessarily. It's like because she's so focused on her job and her career and wanting to like move on. You know, he looks out for her with stuff like when he brings her back home after they've been drinking, and he's just like, "Hey, look, I'm sorry, sir. I just wanted to bring her home safe." And I like also that Tachibana is like very civil with him. She's like, "Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for like bringing her home safely."
Right, and
like it's not like, "Oh, you're being an asshole." It's just like, "Oh, she got drunk. Thank you for looking after her."
But he's a little bit stern, right? Like in the way that like, you know, like a father would be. Like if this random guy brings his daughter home, where like 11 in the morning when he's like, maybe I was a little too mean to that guy.
Right.
And she was like, "Nah, you're fine." Where she's just like, "Nah, he's fine. Don't worry about him."
Right. I'll say it doesn't feel at least as like venomous as it could be. I think, which is part of the charm of that. He's like actually not as much of an asshole, but he's just like very considerate about like, I shouldn't yell at people. I feel shitty. Right,
but he is also just kind of like, "Thank you. Okay, you can go now. I'll take it from here." Like, you know, kind of thing.
Also, I love the set decor in like the offices where she works. Like, it's so like clearly that this is not a very big operation. They're like in one room that's like covered in like newspapers and like takeout menus and shit like that. It's like such a disarray, which makes them true underdogs. They try and like do this investigation because like journalism in the Godzilla movies, aside from like you mentioned, some of the main characters were journalists, but even like news reports and a bunch of other shit like that. There's always kind of like a more official look whenever we see like news reporting about Godzilla, versus having like this kind of handheld thing that you're mentioning. There's a scrappiness. There's like their internet journalists at like in the early millennium. Yeah,
it feels new and it feels very like that thing of like it's the 21st century. How do we update the story to be modern? And then having them be like internet journalists who like, you know, like we're a few years away from them having like a YouTube channel or something.
Right, yes.
But it's before that, so there's still kind of like this scrappy, weird kind of like upstart kind of thing. I love all that stuff.
It's an example of like a sort of early millennium snapshot that doesn't feel like aggressively awful. As someone who was a child during a lot of that era, like the 2000s are kind of like childhood area, and I should feel nostalgic. There's things I feel nostalgic about, but like there's so much fucking like, especially the more we get to like the mid 2000s, the more that's just like an abysmal hellhole of culture.
Yeah,
that we just shouldn't think back on, honestly, as opposed to early 2000s. There's still a bit, once again, pre 9/11. It's like even just on that level also feels like that. But I mean, anyway, let's go back a bit to the kaiju stuff because there's some specific moments I want to highlight.
Okay.
In terms of like Godzilla does. One, the tail thing he does to Baragon is one of my favorite Godzilla moves, where like Baragon like climbs up the gravel pits and is about to like jump on him, and Godzilla's like does this a lot. I love this so much in this movie. He's like turned around, but he knows what's going on, and he's like, wait for it. Bing!
He's like, I fucking see you.
And just Baragon goes flying, like, wow! Which once again, like the kind of, that's an example of like them doing some of that CG like kind of bits where it's like kind of almost looks like it feels like a shot from an anime, but in a way that really works. Because it adds, once again, just like he goes almost like Looney Tunesy, like, but like, and there's like a cloud, like a Wile E. Coyote, like little mushroom thing in the back.
Yeah, and like a kind of not as goofy, but a similar thing is like when the military's like shooting rockets at him, and there's like the CGI rockets in the movie, and it's like following the rockets, which is again just that element of like having a little bit of CGI just to help improve this and make it look a bit more modern, but not too much to make it distracting, because we saw how that worked in Godzilla 2000 already, so, you know.
Right. I think that's what kind of works about it. In terms of, like, the Godzilla stuff, like, he is, as I mentioned, such a bully because, like, he's ahead of so many of these monsters. I think that's what really works. That, like, he's having fun realizing, like, oh, I know how they're gonna fuck up. And I'm gonna like really use that. Like the bit where he's attacking Ghidorah, he's two-fisting two different heads of Ghidorah, which is really cool. And like just like getting rid of one while he like bites into the other one.
There's like blood too, like comes like squirts out of his neck a little bit.
Right. And then Mothra comes gliding in, like, oh, she's gonna like get him while he's like distracted. And he's like, oh yep, she's there. Atomic breath in the face, just like down.
Oh man, yeah. I get another moment I really love is King Ghidorah's introduction, which is this weird CGI where like he's fully CGI, but just the way his like wings like spread out and cover like the whole like.
Well, that's when he gets supercharged after Mothra dies. Right.
Yes.
His introduction is his just like head's kind of like dangling around like classic
That's
style.
true. Yeah.
And I do love, by the way, how like he moves in this movie like when he doesn't have wings. That's the big thing. Like when he's first introduced, popping out of the ground, there aren't any Ghidorah classic wings on, and he just like slides, like he's like on a dolly almost, like sliding at Godzilla, and you can't see his legs because of like all the buildings are at just the perfect height. Because that's always a problem with Ghidorah. I feel like when we've seen these other things, like the legs are barely like mobile because of like the weird construction, particularly like the early Showa suit.
Yeah.
It's like whoever's in there can barely move. Versus like this is one of the examples where they're just kind of like fuck the legs. Let's just have like it like glide down. It adds to kind of like that weird spiritual element of it. Just like he's floating. He's a guardian monster.
Right.
Spooky.
And it also just has that like quality that these movies have of like taking two toys and like, well, King Ghidorah, he moved this way like this, and then Godzilla's there. You know, it has that quality to it.
Right.
as
You would
well,
have like
just-
King Ghidorah looks like he's on a skateboard basically. Like woo.
right, he's on a tech deck.
Oh hell yeah. You might need a couple tech decks, I think.
That's
for
true.
Ghidorah.
He's a big guy. Maybe just an extra large one for him.
One of those thumb guys for support. These are very 2000s era toy references as well.
Yeah.
Look,
Really
it's
live in
the
the
early
moment.
2000s, man. Yeah.
Oh, man. I'm listening to so much new metal right now.
Look, some of those movies. I'll say this much. I'm going to talk about a movie later on that has a Sum 41 needle drop.
Oh, yes.
That's how very, like, new millennium these movies are. But yeah, I guess to go back to GMK, so any other, like, sort of kaiju moments you want to shout out that we haven't mentioned? Some of the things.
There's a moment I really love where the military is still fighting Godzilla, and the kind of commander is like, make another run. He's got to have a weak spot. Get him from the side. And just this wide shot you get of Godzilla just, like, obliterating a fighter jet like it's a little bug. Like, he's just like, pew, and just, like, destroys it. And it's so great. And it's, again, the blending of that thing we keep talking about of these analog, like, suits and sets and stuff like that, but with the CGI of, like, his fire breath and the jet being, you know, right there. All that stuff just blends, like, so well. And I think the whole movie just really has that quality to it that makes me really miss when, especially, like, a very early 2000s thing of, like, when movies could have CGI not be, like, the dominating thing of visual effects, right? They were just this tool that you could use sparingly throughout your movie. I just really miss that.
After the series has been affected by one of the more infamous examples of, like, CG, we can do anything, Roland Emmerich.
Right, exactly.
Right, with just, like, that creature, and you can definitely tell, like, these movies obviously are, as we mentioned, in reaction to that one. So it definitely feels like we'll have digital elements, like you mentioned Ghidorah, when he ends up getting powered up by Mothra, like, he becomes digital.
Yes.
But at the same time, there's a style to the digital work that fits with the practical stuff, and more importantly, just makes it feel, once again, even more odd as a movie.
Yeah, it's like that early CGI thing where the technology's not there, so it doesn't have to look photorealistic. It can still look a bit like cartoonish or whatever, but it's really charming because of that. It's almost like going back and playing, like, PlayStation 2 games from, like, this time, right? Where, like, they don't look realistic, but there is still that charm to it where, like, they're doing what they can artistically to make it look interesting. Yeah, which I really love about this movie. Also, did we mention that they kind of reference the American movie, right? At the beginning when they're like, oh yeah, there was maybe a Godzilla in New York, but, you know, whatever.
But, yeah, I believe the exchange is, didn't Godzilla attack New York in 1998? You know, that's what the Americans said, but our experts are saying, nah, that ain't true. Which is a really, really solid dig. One of two digs that the Millennium Era does directly. Or maybe even a couple. Was there one in 2000? Or Mechaguirus?
I don't think there was one in 2000, but I can't remember because I was too busy being bored.
Well, and having him fight, what was it, Orga? Isn't that the monster in it? Like the big fucking...
I've already forgotten because...
Like, it's the weird kind of, like,
Orga
eel thing, yeah. Whatever that was. But with this, yes, you can tell, like, that this is in such a direct conversation with that movie in terms of, like, okay, how do we utilize whatever CG elements here? But I think it's mainly used just for, especially the scale elements, which we kind of referenced earlier. But there are so many great perspective shots of people running in terror, like some of the best compositing Truly, I think I've said that a couple times, but this might be the height
This
to me
is absolutely
of like compositing with the human actors, especially like the shots we were mentioning, like from a lot of window perspective stuff, a lot of like great car stuff. There's a really great shot of like one of the characters driving in the car, and like through the windshield we see Godzilla coming. And even like there are some that are a bit more cartoony than others. Like there's the one shot after like he rises that we're mentioning, where the compositing looks a bit rougher for that, but also in a way once again where it almost feels like this Godzilla is so weird and you're put off by like him that it's like he's changing the environment. Like he kind of has the energy almost of like a crazed cartoon character has entered our world and cares not for human life. So he's gonna fuck with things. Like, it almost feels kind of like the weird original pitch for Cool World that Ralph Bakshi wanted to do. With like, this is the full realization of Ralph Bakshi's original vision, is what I'm saying.
Oh man, I didn't think we'd get a Cool World reference today.
Look, GMK is a weird movie, brings out weird things.
You were mentioning like all the perspective shots and stuff. There's one I really love that is CGI, which is the Baragon is like destroying the prison that the old guy's being held at, and you just see his eye like through the cell, and the guys are like, it's Godzilla, like they think it's Godzilla, and it looks so good, even though it is the CGI monster. And just a great way to get like this perspective shot of like how little these people are and how big his eye is. I love that.
Another sort of kaiju moment I want to bring up, Ghidorah gets yeeted in this movie. Like Godzilla grabs him and fucking throws him across the cityscape, which is like so amazing. That's the thing, is like this movie also kind of feels like somebody who, like you can tell that Kaneko is like maybe more of a Gamera fan, given he did 3 of those. But you can tell he like respects and likes Godzilla, but he's like, I don't know, but what if we did some of this weird shit? This is truly a movie about mixing up kind of like because at this time with like 2000 and Mechagodzilla, those feel much more back to basics in a way that ends up being kind of like familiar and rote with both of those movies. Versus him coming in for the third one, it's just like, okay, I'm going to do a reboot. What am I going to do? Godzilla's going to fucking yeet Ghidorah. That's never happened in one of these movies before. Sure, why not?
Well, yeah, and it's that quality of just like, well, we've been making these for 50 years already, and we've done so much. Like, why not just do like weird, crazy, just insane shit like we see in this movie? Like, it does feel like that, and I love that Kaneko was kind of smart enough to realize all of that and kind of make this movie that feels very weird. In a way, feels kind of back to basics because of like the darker themes, which feel like they're in line with the original 54 movie, but again has all these weird newer elements to it that just work really well.
By the way, apparently I should mention this when I was talking about some of the origin stuff. Apparently another one he considered for being part of this that might have worked in an interesting way for like one of the Guardian monsters would have been Kamacuras, who was the praying mantis creature from Son of Godzilla.
Oh yeah, that thing's pretty cool actually.
Right. Which would be interesting. It also kind of fits like sort of a version of like an Earth creature that would attack, especially. But I think the reason for not doing that was because Mechagodzilla was going to have like the more insectoid kaiju, so Toho didn't want to like repeat themselves.
Also could have had a really kind of gnarly, creepy design for what was his name again? I already forgot.
Kamacuras? It's Kamacuras.
Oh, I see it. Yeah,
Cures.
Yes. Okay.
Kamacuras.
Right.
Yeah.
You could definitely see a version of a redesign for that character for this movie. Like that would be kind of interesting to see.
That creature does show up briefly in Final Wars. One of 500 monsters that show up in Final Wars for like, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds of screen time. It's just like, they gotta fit everybody in there, Bryan. It's like, I don't know, like over 25 monsters I think show up.
Jesus, okay.
It's crazy. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a moment. But you know what? We've been talking for a while about GMK. Any final things we didn't mention about GMK before we get to like final thoughts? Anything? Any stray things before we wrap up on GMK?
I like the kind of emotional conclusion of this movie with Yuri and Tachibana. I like at the end where he's like, I haven't checked radiation, like stay away from me. I'm like,
right.
Good, recognizing social distancing. But I like that emotional beat at the end where, I don't know, it's just very beautiful in a way that kind of reminded me of -1 as well, of just really heartfelt and sincere emotional like storytelling in this thing, which I just really love. And just the way that like Yuri as our protagonist fits so well with like her dad being involved in the military, her having a journalist, like being involved in journalism. It just like is such a clean and neat kind of like way that this movie kind of intersects between all of its elements of like the monster stuff, like Yuri stuff, and the military side of things. It just all like flows really well together. But yeah, I guess that's my final point there.
Well, I mean, we should also kind of mention we haven't gotten into like Godzilla's death in this movie.
Oh my god, right, yeah.
Right, yes. Because basically after all this is going on, Tachibana, before he has this moment that Bryan talked about, the climax of the movie is basically him after his buddy fucks up and shoots Ghidorah. He's like, okay, these conventional weapons aren't going to work. They're trying to aim for like there's a wound in Godzilla that they're trying to hit. So that they can potentially like get somewhere into like his bloodstream and like kill him. And, you know, Tachibana is just like, you know what, there's only one way I can solve this. And in a move that kind of mirrors Godzilla -1 more specifically, aims for the mouth, gets swallowed.
Yeah. So
but,
weird.
Though
Really
this time he goes like full Fantastic Voyage. Like he goes in to the fucking Godzilla's stomach.
We're going into like Godzilla's intestines. Like it's in a movie already filled with so much insane shit. That just feels like such a weird and wild moment that I'm just like, yes, this is like, please go for it. Like this is great.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. So like he gets swallowed by Godzilla, and there's a great moment where like when he's down there and he's like he kind of passes out for a second. He sees an image of Yuri, like a ghostly visage of Yuri, like talk to him, just like, please, you gotta get out of here, Dad. And he's like, you know, I gotta keep going. And then he ends up finding a way basically to create a hole in Godzilla that'll like and block off his throat as well. So like the moment he tries to like he rises again from the water in front of Yuri.
Yes.
And which is another great perspective shot of like Yuri and her buddy just being like, oh my god, he's right in front of us. And he's about to use his atomic breath. He's like, oh boy, I've been seeing you motherfuckers around here. Okay, it's time for me to use my atomic breath and just completely pulverize you guys. And then he charges up, and then it doesn't come out of his mouth, but it starts coming out of his back.
So hard. It's so cool. He's
just like, fuck, what?
It took me a minute to figure out what was happening, right? Because I was like, oh, he's trying to do the breath. Oh my god, it's like coming out of his like his shoulder back area. Like it's such a unique and like just fucking cool way of like handling like Godzilla's death and like actually like just such a weird and wild swing this movie takes.
Yeah, and once again, just making him fully like malicious. Like his last act is to try and be like such a piece of shit and just be like, oh man, I'm back. Guess what? I was underwater for a minute. King Ghidorah couldn't fucking pull me down though. I'm good, everybody. Don't worry about it. Which also, just a little bit, when after they're fighting the water, there's that great bit where like Yuri falls into the water and then gets saved by your buddy. And you just see in the background like one Ghidorah fly up and then Godzilla start going up. It's such a great like the foreground and background distillation. It's like seamless almost. Like nope, they're in the same fucking waterway with this giant fucking kaiju.
There's a lot of stuff like that where it's like people looking out at like the land, the skyline that has been like scorched, and it all looks like there's like the water in the foreground with like boats and like ships and stuff, and it looks so seamless. And it's like just that quality of just post Dawn of the New Millennium of like, this is it. This is as good as like movies can get now that we have like CGI. Yeah, it looks so great. All of those like big wide shots are just so great, and it's like satisfying to like look at.
You know what? Just one more final thing before we get into final thoughts. I want to correct myself here. I said that nobody was in the King Ghidorah suit. I was inaccurate. Looking at the cast list, Mr. Akira Ohashi was in the suit. I want to apologize. I'm sure Mr. Ayashi had to suffer in that giant fucking Ghidorah suit. I always feel so bad for like, I feel like out of all of the classic monsters, a Ghidorah suit would be the most of a hassle to be in, right?
Yeah, how does is it, I'm assuming head through the middle, arms are the two heads?
Well, no. I think, and especially the Showa era ones, it's definitely like marionettes, and it's just
Right.
somebody in like what I would assume is like pretty much from like Ghidorah's like neckline down. There's somebody. I think that's usually what it is. And I think even like in this case, it feels like, especially where like at least he doesn't have to be like on his feet. I'm sure he got to like slide around based on the way he was kind of like moving around and shit like that. But at the same time, yeah, I feel like that'd kind of be the worst. At the same time, though, even being in this Godzilla suit in particular, I feel like would be upsetting, especially just because it feels heavier. I think that's part of it because I don't know, Godzilla. He's much more like curvy in this movie, I would say.
He is, yeah.
He's got a lot of curves on him.
He's a very chunky Godzilla, especially with all those like low shots we get of him, like just of his thighs and like his crotch.
To be fair, I prefer my Godzillas with a bit of thickness.
Oh, I do too. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's a big part of why Zilla sucks so much. Like, so skinny.
Yeah.
Like a twig.
Yeah.
He ate a lot of fish, too.
Oh my god. Fucking god. That's a lot of fish.
A lot of fish.
I hate that movie.
Shut up, Gene.
God.
When we're talking about Godzilla 98 quotes, it's time that we start wrapping up. So, final thoughts on, I'll just repeat it once again. Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, giant monsters, all -out attack. Bryan, final thoughts.
Yeah, this is one of the best Godzilla movies. I don't have my definitive ranking yet. God, I'm kind of dreading doing that, but like, this is one of the like crown jewels of the Godzilla franchise, I think, and especially if anyone out there kind of maybe finds the Showa era too intimidating because there's so many movies, or because of just the visual effects and how kind of like primitive and kind of chintzy they are, like maybe that's kind of a barrier for you. I think this is one of the best ones to kind of get into a lot of these kind of, I say older, it's only 20 years old, but you know what I mean, like these Godzilla movies. I think this is such a fantastic movie that is both incredibly dark and incredibly menacing and kind of creepy in a lot of like its imagery and just its themes and stuff like that, but also still has a lot of that lightness that even the Showa and Heisei era kind of do, and it feels kind of goofy and it feels very fun. I feel like they have not forgotten the fun of these movies, that they're supposed to be very fun monster movies, but also you can have these themes of history repeating itself and history being lost and all this stuff that is so compelling. The human elements, I think, are genuinely really compelling in this movie, and like I've liked them for a majority of the time, but a majority of the time they are kind of just they're just to kind of service the Godzilla parts of the movie. Really, they don't feel necessarily as fleshed out or anything, but in this they feel really, like I said earlier, just very clean, very very neat in the way that everything kind of ties together. And also, I mean, God, what a great final shot of the movie, of it being Godzilla's beating heart at the bottom of the
Godzilla
ocean.
heart.
Yep, and you get the Ifukube score at the end there, which just feels so like incredible just at the end to just play that music, and you just like, you're like, fuck yes, this is so great. Yeah, I love this movie. It's one of the best ones, and also it just still feels like, even though this came out like 20 something years ago, it still feels modern in a lot of ways. Like there isn't even though a lot of the CGI is early, but it still feels new and modern and fresh, and like a fresh take for Godzilla, and I really love that about it. Yeah, great movie, man. Great movie.
Glad to hear. Yeah, because as I said before, this is my favorite Godzilla movie. I think I was curious as I was revisiting some of these, because I'll just say, as I've been revisiting some of the other Godzilla movies, my list has shifted a bit. Some I've liked a bit more than others. Like I've turned either in a good way or a bad way on a couple of these that I've revisited. And I was kind of worried with GMK, like, is it going to lose a bit of its luster after -1? Because -1, I was just like, it could like beat it for me, but I think the big thing is with this one, as much as I love Godzilla Minus One, we talked about it previously. I think what this one has is just, like I said, the perfect mix of, like, the human elements are just enough to give you a solid emotional backbone for these characters where you care about them, but they don't overcrowd the story. They move the story along in a really interesting way. There is even, like, fun, sort of, like, weird spirituality stuff that's in here. Like, we didn't really mention that the character we referenced earlier, Mr. Ishiyama, occurs throughout the movie, especially, like, in Ghidorah's cave. Yes. It's just sitting there looking like, wait, is he gonna come out? Is he gonna do it? Ah, there he is! It's Ghidorah! And then later on, the news team, after it's just like, oh man, we gotta tell Mr. Ishiyama, maybe get an interview with him. It's just like, Mr. Ishiyama, like Professor Hiroshoti Ishiyama, he's been dead for 50 years.
Weird. And I love that the movie just kind of casually drops that at the end. It's so strange. I also just do love. I just thought about this. Like when they're all in the newsroom having that little meeting, and they're like, "We can become huge after this." Like I love just the way that they all feel very like. It's really a win for like them, and just kind of like as you mentioned earlier, like the underdogs of this movie, and I love that they kind of have this moment of like, we did it. Like we can like do big things now. It rules.
Right. But at the same time, they also realize, like, wait, the ghost who we interviewed, he's removed from the tape now. I love the fact that, like, he was on the tape earlier, and then once everything was resolved, it's just like, well, my work here is done. Time to erase. Like, he brought a magnet over and just went on the tape and just got rid of himself. Or he just went in with, like, a really advanced version of Photoshop. I don't know. Ghosts maybe have access to far earlier computer technology.
Well, they're using the technology from fucking Collateral Beauty, right? Where they just have like fucking super Photoshop or whatever.
Holy shit.
That's right.
That's like an even ground with my earlier reference. It's a cool world to have a Collateral Beauty reference.
Yeah.
The cool world of 2016, I would argue. A movie we must talk about. I'm making that a promise. I want to talk extensively about that fucking movie.
My God.
And how baffling it is for every single person involved in it.
Yeah. Oh, man. Everyone should watch Collateral Beauty tonight who's listening to this.
If you forgot what it is, oh, baby. Oof, you have no idea.
What a premise for that movie.
Anyway. Look, we're not talking about that schlock. We're talking about GMK. Just to keep going, I mean, like, all that human stuff works so wonderfully, but at the same time, it leaves enough room for just some of my favorite monster stuff in any of these movies. I think because you mentioned, like, the mix of having, like, you know, the ability to composite perfectly with computers while still keeping to the regular suit stuff, and even having a couple CG. Like, there's a CG Godzilla shot in this movie, briefly, of him, like, swimming. Mm-hmm. That's not that bad at all, actually. It's probably the best of, like, the completely CG versions of the kaiju, necessarily. Especially after, 2000 had a really bad, like, N64 shot of him swimming.
It's so bad.
But yeah, I think just overall with all that monster stuff, there's like there's a fun, but at the same time a nightmarish quality to it. Mm-hmm. It just works so wonderfully in a way that, once again, it feels kind of like there's a bit of like, someone who has seen Godzilla movies and doesn't like, you know, and wants to do like different things with it, but at the same time also a bit of an energy of like a kid who likes all these characters but isn't like extremely 100% on the continuity. Like a person who, admittingly, if I had been into Godzilla as a child, if it's anything like the way that I played with my Simpsons action figures, I was very against going off of canon. Sure. Which is like, no, we can't do that. Like, my sisters would literally come in with, like, those Simpsons toys and be like, Marge is having an affair with this other character. I'm like, how fucking dare you? That's Marge Simpson.
Yeah, Marge would never do that. Like,
right. Yes, that kind of thing. I would probably be the same way about, like, King Ghidorah can't be a hero. What are you talking about? This is dumb. But luckily, I'm not following, like, that dumb, like, subservience to fucking, the canon necessarily, especially even with, like, a King Ghidorah. Like, sure, whatever, especially for something that feels so almost, like, kind of Elseworldsy, where the continuity of this one apparently is 54, American Godzilla 98, GMK. Right. Like, that's technically a continuity, a trilogy within this whole thing. Because it's, like, it's got that kind of, like, selective kind of cul-de-sac it can play in. It just, like, goes all out, just does all the weird shit. Like, I would never want an actual sequel to GMK to any degree. Because I think GMK just, like, stands alone. It's just, like, this insane, weird reaction of, like, okay, we're going to have some of the stuff from Godzilla 54, but There's fucking ghosts of the victims of Japan's atrocities during World War II. There's Godzilla who has white eyes that will capture your soul. And then also he does sick little fucked up things like, oh, that lays in the hospital. Fuck you, right with the tail after I try and say, like, oh, everything's fine, don't worry, psych, oh, you're gone. Like, having that kind of, once again, the personality that I love so much about, like, all these characters. It's really present there, and even in Mothra and King Ghidorah and Baragon, just everything that is embodied here about what I love about what a kaiju movie can be, in general. Not just even Godzilla specifically, but just that a kaiju movie is like, yeah, we're already starting off with the weirdness of giant monsters. Now, all this other shit. And it doesn't feel like too many hats on the rack. It's like, no, all these hats fit perfectly. It looks so good. It's so great. Love GMK. Truly my fave of the Godzilla canon. But on that note, let's go ahead and go into our weekly segment, Between the Lines. So on every episode of Cinema to the Letter, Bryan and I end up doing a little recommendation thing here with Between the Lines, where Bryan and I each have a film that relates in some way to, the episode we're talking about. Maybe an alternate M for Masterpiece pick for Godzilla, or maybe something just related, maybe from the same Millennium Era, which I believe is the case for the both of us. We're recommending Millennium Era Godzilla films. Bryan, you're going first. What's your recommendation for Between the Lines?
Yeah, my recommendation is the only other good Millennium movie I've seen so far. I'm recommending Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, not versus. He's going against him this time, which is the film right after this one in the chronology of the Millennium Era, and also kind of fucking slaps. I really, really, really enjoyed this. I think I've said before on this miniseries, I love Mechagodzilla. He just kind of itches that part of my brain that's just like, he's Godzilla, but if he was a robot, that's so cool. And this movie also, like, I also just really love the use of Mechagodzilla as this kind of like defense for the military. Like, they use him as, a defense to fight Godzilla, and this movie does that as well and has just a really incredible Mechagodzilla design, but just so many weird elements to this movie, like a weapon I just absolutely love and I've thought of since I watched this, the Absolute Zero cannon, which fires at things and like melts them basically to like dust because it turns them into Absolute Zero. But also this movie also has a much more prominent human element where you have this like pilot who has this like guilt because of an early Godzilla's attack that we see where her like superior officer dies, and she's kind
it's
of
basically the cold open of this movie,
right,
that we see.
Right, and the fault is kind of put on her. She gets kind of put on a desk job, and it is about her just kind of dealing with that guilt, but also becoming like a genuine hero and saving saving the day. I really, really enjoyed this movie. I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about with GMK, I think fits with this movie. It maybe has a bit more CGI, I think, but I don't think it's bad necessarily. I think it's still kind of really charming, and I think there are a lot of elements that I really love about it. Like, I think there's a point where Godzilla just does like a jump like up, and then he comes back down, like,
Yes,
like over there. It's a really goofy, but I really, really enjoyed this movie. I think it is also one of the better versions of doing a Mechagodzilla, and again, just doing it with an updated version in the 2000s with all this technology they have. It's just a really, really, really great movie. I would say a really great follow up to GMK. If you watch GMK and you're just like, oh, I want another like kind of one of these, I think it's a very worthy like follow up to that. I think it's a great movie. Yeah, I mean, you also like this movie. I saw that you rewatched this kind of recently.
Yes, this is one of the ones I watched and prepped for this particular episode. And yeah, I would say it's my second favorite of the Millennium Era. And it's in my top 10, I would say, of Godzilla movies. Nothing else, because I think it does such a great job with, like, one, maybe this is a hot take, my favorite Mechagodzilla design. Like, I would say. I think
good.
it has the right mix of tactility, but that same kind of, like, sharp, angular nature of, like, the original suit at the same time, which I like all the different Godzilla designs. I kind of was dissing versus Mechagodzilla 2 last week about that design.
Yeah, you were.
Yeah, being a bit more a disservice. I'm sorry, Mechagodzilla's #1 fan over here, recommending 2 in a row.
I did, yeah. Look, I don't know. It is just that thing of it reverts me back to like being a kid, and just being like, it's the guy I know, but he's a robot, and he's like all metal.
Well, wait, and also my favorite origin point for Mechagodzilla in this movie, where the 54 movie is canon to the degree that everyone's like, okay, how do we fight Godzilla this time? Well, we have the bones of the earlier Godzilla are still underneath the water. We're gonna build a fucking mech around the bones of Godzilla.
Yep.
That's so fucking metal, literally and figuratively.
Yeah. Right, and the way that it then rebels against the humans, basically, it's insane, right? Like, it has a lot of the insanity that GMK has, but you just got Mechagodzilla now, and it's great. Sorry, I interrupted you, I think, while you were saying something.
Well, I mean, I want to just shout out, like you were mentioning the protagonist earlier, Lieutenant Kane Yashiro, as played by Yumiko Shaku, another one of my favorite protagonists in any of these movies.
Yeah.
Because, like you mentioned, there's a great arc for that character where she fully, like, she's initially involved, and then somebody dies on her watch, and, like, she has to have a desk job. She's off the force, as it were. She's not on the field anymore. And I just love the fact that the movie is about her basically trying to prove herself. Totally. We're just like, no, I can do this. Godzilla is very much tied into just like her sort of like trying to gain some self-esteem again. That's her journey. I love all those elements of it. And I think she's truly like another example of like a great strong protagonist like Yuri from this movie.
Yes. I also just like that they name Mechagodzilla Kiryu. They just give it like a nickname for some reason. It's really funny.
Right, and that's what they call it. Kiru.
Yeah.
The whole movie, yeah. And a great battle as well. Like, that Mechagodzilla suit gets to, like, fly around. There's one point, at least I remember, where, like, he does, like, a full jump and punch down at Godzilla. Which fucking rules. That's one of my favorite just moves in a kaiju movie.
Yeah, like, I love, like, Mechagodzilla 2 from the Heisei era, but this one also just kind of... It's different enough, right? Like, it is doing a lot of those things that we talked about with GMK, with the goofier kind of almost anime kind of stuff going on. Yeah, just a really, really great movie. Just one of the better ones that I've really seen.
Interesting fact that also this is directed by Masaki Tezuka, who had directed Mechagodzilla previously and would direct Tokyo SOS afterward, which, Tokyo SOS, like I mentioned before, direct sequel, so it feels kind of connected. But yeah, Mechagodzilla, this feels definitely like a step up from that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Mechagodzilla is kind of... just feels like a shrug, in a weird way. Right. I don't know, it's very forgettable.
Yes, I would agree with that. But I'm going to move on here and talk about one I would not say is that forgettable, because for a while, it was the final Godzilla film. And appropriately, it is called Godzilla, Final Wars, which was the 50th anniversary. Godzilla movie came out in 2004. We kind of referenced some things about it earlier, but basically, this involves this whole thing where after these environmental disasters have happened with these kaiju, there has been the Earth Defense Force has been established, which basically involves like, all these like scientists and, like military people and stuff like that kind of working together to kind of try and stop like Godzilla and other kaiju from attacking, to the degree that Godzilla has been entrapped in an ice space, like during a cave-in happened, which kind of is like, how they got rid of him in Raids Again, right? It's like the big like Snowy Glacier Mountain. They like trapped him in there.
Sounds right. But that was about 20 movies ago, so I can't remember.
And Rates Again is another one that's
Also,
kind of a shrug.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, not great. But point is, Godzilla's literally like being guarded at a base that's in the ice mountains, basically. While this is all going on, aliens invade.
Very natural for the Godzilla
Right.
movies.
And they've basically been able to capture kaiju that have been dormant for so long. They awaken them and then drop them in different places. Like there's an early, not great scene to show the cartooniness of this movie. One of the examples of like sort of American actors appearing is there's a bit where like the first monster who attacks is Rodan attacks New York.
Of course.
And initially they established this by having this interaction between a cop and a black actor dressed like a pimp, because it's 2004.
Okay.
And there's also a homeless man on the side who's just like, oh, I can't believe this is going on. He's like literally got a bottle in hand, and then he just looks up just like, it's a big birdie, and then like fucking Rodan makes his appearance and he like lands on the fucking Empire State Building. And it fucking rules. That's the tone of this movie, basically. Is
Okay.
that little image of just like something inane is happening on the streets, while all of a sudden like a kaiju is like making full force appearance in like a random location. So various different kaiju are in different places. This includes, let me get the list out because there's a massive list. You got Rodan, like I mentioned earlier, but also Gigan shows up, Anguirus, Ebera, King Caesar. Like we're going deep cut with some of these. Manila shows up.
Oh, God.
At one point. It's a weird design too, where it's like kind of trying to be close to the original design, but it's like a lot more textured. So all these monsters are attacking everywhere. And Earth is like, oh, okay, we gotta find out what it is. And that's when they find out it's these aliens who, all the aliens are like humanoid and they dress up like they're rejects from the Matrix. Like it's all black leather. But there's a bit more spikiness. It kind of feels like a bit Power Rangers-y as well. Because at the same time that like a lot of this stuff is going on the ground, with all the kaiju stuff's going on the ground, you've got like these aliens versus these like the Earth Defense Force, and they're like doing big fucking like martial arts fights. There's a big sequence that's like right out of Mission Impossible 2 where they're on motorcycles shooting at each other, like on a freeway. There's like just big like giant kicks and punches. One of my favorite examples of like, once again, a non-Japanese actor showing up in one of these movies, a guy named Don Fry, who plays Captain Douglas Gordon, who's like the chief sort of American guy. I want you to look up a picture of Don Fry in this movie, because it's so wild. I've referenced him a couple times on this series, but he's big and bulky. He kind of looks like M. Bison. And he's got like a giant like push broom of a mustache. And he carries around like a katana, and he wears like a big burlap coat. Yeah, you're looking at him?
Yeah. Wow. He's got like
What a character, right?
tooth around his neck, like on a necklace, or is that a knife?
No, it's like a tooth of some sort. That's like one of his like trophies, because one of the things is like he was involved with like the last attack on Godzilla that kind of put him inside the IC. He put him in the cave-in, and he's like a legend of the program for so long because of that. And there's like, oh, I guess they gotta come back again. And he carries around a fucking katana, Bryan, and he goes around like just burly brawling so many different people. He rules, but the whole cast is great. I should mention, this is the last time Akira Takarada was in one of these movies, and he plays a great part as like the sort of the UN ambassador for Japan. But initially he seems kind of off because, spoilers, his visage has been taken over by the aliens. That's how they kind of invade American society. It's like, he's just like, oh, don't worry about it, everything's fine. And there's like a whole talk show scene where he's like, don't worry, everything's fine, it's all good. And then one of the main protagonists reveals their true form, and like the head opens up and there's a weird alien face in it.
Fuck yeah. Oh my god.
This movie's crazy. That's my big thing, guys. This movie's fucking wild. Like, it has all that stuff going on the ground, while also there are kaiju in this movie. And this is obviously one of the famous things about this movie is Zilla does make an appearance. The Godzilla from the 1998 version of things. But he's in the movie for literally like 30 seconds. Because you see him initially attack like some random, I think it's like Australia. Because later on, they have Godzilla, like, when he's unleashed, basically. The second half of this movie, like the first half of this is a lot of, like, just, Godzilla goes to, like, the various kaiju are, like, attacking different cities, and then Godzilla is awoken about halfway through, and then he's like, alright, I'm gonna fuck all of them up. And he just systematically beats every kaiju, including Zilla, which is literally a 30-second fight. And that's where also they have the Sum 41 needle drop that I mentioned earlier.
Yes. Well, Zilla's weak sauce, okay? He doesn't have the juice that these other kaiju have, okay?
I mean, also one of my favorite lines, like the main villain guy says, where he's just like, that overgrown tuna head wasn't gonna make it work anyway. Like, that's also the kind of vibe we're going for as well with this. Which, I want to shout out that guy. Kazuki Kitamura. Who, by the way, the big thing is the alien race. It's the Zillions again from Invasion of the Astro Monsters. Yeah. It's like the new version of these, and you can tell that with like the designs. Like I mentioned, there's kind of a Matrixy quality, but it also feels like they're kind of paying tribute a bit to like the Zillions in particular. But at the same time, now they can fucking like battle with fucking martial arts and like wire fu and shit. It's also tremendous, and like I mean, there's so many great kaiju moments. There's one involving Anguirus, like is able to go into a ball, which is one of my favorite things. He like becomes a ball and like bowling balls his way through a city.
Cool.
It's cool shit like that. Yeah, and I also really like the Godzilla design. It's different from most of the other Millennium movies, and it has like it's a bit more angular. This is actually one of the ones, because we should mention this because these are newer movies. These are the only suits that have really survived. Like, there's a couple of the Heisei era, but like there's Bryan. If you want to make yourself cry after like this series, look up like the deteriorating Showa suits. There's so many photos of them just like rotting in like the little Toho landfill they put them in. Circle back. It's within my like top 15 of Godzilla movies, Godzilla Final Wars, which is to say like it's definitely silly. Like the human elements aren't engrossing like we were just talking about for so long with GMK. Mm-hmm. It's not quite like that, but it's like it's very fun. It's very spirited. It's definitely one I would say where it's like if you want to have somebody be introduced to like a more at least like kind of cotton candy version of Godzilla, this is a great example of that. Where it gives them once again a smorgasbord of all the different monsters, much more I would argue even than like as much as I really like Destroy All Monsters. I think that's the better movie overall. This one has a bit less of like the monster problem that our guest Bill Mulligan was talking about, just in terms of there's so many of them, they're spread out throughout the movie. But also just be aware that like say if you're going to it for the second appearance of Ghidorah, who we'll be talking about soon, he is in that movie I believe for 30 frames. He's just like barely in there. Like just shows up, gets like plucked by I believe Rodan, and then just kind of gets fucked off, basically. But you mentioned you haven't seen this one because you haven't gone through the Millennium Era yet. But
no, yeah. But I'm very curious, and I'm also just very curious because of what you've mentioned, just how weird it sounds, but also just how like all the different monsters. I'm very curious to see how that is handled and how big it goes. I imagine it goes big for like it being the last one, but also it being like the 50th anniversary of Godzilla.
And if nothing else, it's a great final note for the Suitmation to go out on, because that is the last one with the Suitmation, which I do, as much as we mentioned we love Godzilla -1, they can go back to another Suit one, right? At least do one more of those.
They could do one, yeah. I mean, because we've had, like, especially with this new kind of, the new Toho ones, we've had Shin Godzilla and -1. I think, like, they're kind of showing that they want to do maybe some different stuff with Godzilla, so I would love for them to go back to, Guy in suit. Especially I would love to see, we talked about with GMK, like, using CGI to kind of like help, blend a lot of that stuff together. Imagine what you could do now with, a guy in a rubber suit and just doing a lot of like meshing of, practical and CGI effects. It'd be really interesting.
One of my few sort of like little gripes about Shin Godzilla, when the original set photos came out, they had built a puppet, like an actual physical puppet that looks like Shin Godzilla, and I was like, oh, I can't wait to fucking see that. And the CG in Shin Godzilla is great, not decrying it whatsoever, but at the same time, I wish we had some of that puppet, man.
That's true.
Give like a couple shots of that fucking puppet, that's all.
Yeah.
On that note, on our rambly between the lines segment, let's end it up here by restating our titles for anyone in case you want to add into your watch list or whatever. Bryan.
Yes, I had the 2002, looking up the year, 2002 other Millennium movie, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla.
Right, against. They're not fighting. It's just he doesn't believe in Mechagodzilla's terms.
Right.
I don't think, right. They disagree on an ideological
They're
level,
debating,
really,
yeah.
this one. Right, debating in the marketplace of ideas. And then I had the final Millennium film and the last suit motion Godzilla movie, Godzilla Final Wars. And we're going to be wrapping up the show here, but we got to thank some people. We got to thank Burial Grid for all of our music on the show. Purchase this music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork finder at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our supporters on Patreon, patreon.com/cinema number 2 letter, where for just $1 a month, you get access to bonus podcasts we put out over there and get to vote for at least one episode in a miniseries. And we should say around this time, you know, we're kind of, when this episode's coming out, it's kind of like Memorial Day weekend or so. We're getting close to the end of May. We would have probably put out our Mad Max Fury Road commentary. And soon we'll be having our Furiosa audio review, which we're a few weeks out. We're about a month away, actually, when we're recording this from Furiosa. But, that fire burning inside. Can't wait for it.
I'm so excited. One of my most anticipated movies of the year, maybe, especially definitely of the summer. Yeah,
for sure. Yes. But you can hear our thoughts on that, as well as the Mad Max commentary, or so many hours of content. Patreon.com/cinema number 2 letter. Just for that $1, you can access to all sorts of stuff. And it really helps out the show, really helps us, you know, move along here and keep bumbling around like the big kaiju that we are. But you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at cinema number 2 letter. And, you know, any of the socials, any of the hell sites you visit, we're at cinema number 2 letter. And you can also find me specifically on Twitter and Letterboxd at Not the Who's Tommy. And I also do some writing at film-cred.com occasionally.
Yeah, and you can also follow me on Twitter at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or you can follow me on Letterboxd as well, where I'm much more active, because Twitter is awful.
What? No. And are you saying that like every time you go on it, you feel depressed about the world?
Look, a bit of behind the scenes. We're about to record thoughts on the Rebel Moon movies. And people are just really normal about Zack Snyder on Twitter, especially.
On Twitter in particular, yes. Yeah. Or, what was his... Vimo? What was his fucking social media site that I think he still posts on occasionally?
Oh, I don't remember.
Vero? It's some bullshit like that.
Vero, yeah.
That's where he would just post exclusive things, and all the people that were just Zack Snyder fans trying to communicate with him.
In other news, follow me on Vero now.
Keep asking about Gahul. When will we get more Gahul, Zach? When? By the way, you could hear that Rebel Moon thing on the Patreon as well. That would have already been posted. What is going to be in a second for us is weeks ago for you all out there.
Time, man.
Time travel. Yeah, it's wild. But, you know, the free way to help us out, if you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight. The free way to help us out is to just subscribe to us on, like, Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platform, or listen to some of the other Talk Film Society shows. If you're, you know, perusing on that feed, there's all sorts of great shows, and Bryan and I have guested on a couple different podcasts over there. And you can also dig into the archives on our Podbean main feed for, like, all the previous Cinema to the Letter episodes, on the Double Edge Double Bill stuff. You can find all of that there. And nothing else, if, you know, like we mentioned, the absolute best free way to help us out if you can't support us on the Patreon is to rate, review, or share the show around to give us more visibility. You know, make sure that we are not ghosts of the past that come back to haunt you in the form of a pupilless kaiju god-killing monster that attacks your village with menace. Don't let that happen, guys.
And kills people while they're peeing at a urinal. Just rude manners.
Truly. Not just like a malevolent, evil monster of unholy fathomability, but just a dick.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah, truly. But on that note, Bryan, it's time we ended this episode because we gotta prepare ourselves for the finale of our Godzilla season. We're heading toward the end, and at the end of every season, we do an A for Atypical Choice, and oh boy, Bryan, do we have an atypical choice? We have, as picked by our patrons, at patreon.com/cinema2letter, those cineast patrons, and ended up voting between Godzilla vs. Megalon and the actual winner, Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, aka Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster from 1971. Truly one of the strangest films in this very strange series, and I say that with authority. But this is one of the last ones you haven't seen, Bryan. You've been saving it for this particular episode. Now, how curious are you now that you're near the end of your Godzilla journey?
Yeah, I'm very curious, especially because I'll be going back to the Showa era. I kind of jumped over it when I was doing the Showa era movies, and I'm very curious, yeah, because I've heard many people say it's a very weird movie, and having seen almost 30 of these, I wonder how they can get stranger, or I wonder what strange is relative to
Right.
all these other movies.
What is atypical, as it were,
Right.
for a
Yes.
Godzilla film. Yes, as we'll talk about next time. But on that note, everybody, Bryan, I'm going to go hit the urinal. I think I'll be fine, right?
Yeah,
Just you won't feel any earthquakes?
Yeah, be careful. Just, don't get smushed.
Yeah, you keep playing pool over there in your weird, like, orange jumpsuit, basically, that you're wearing as a fucking
Oh,
outfit,
man.
because you're a teenager in the early 2000s.
Oh, man. Those kids, they fucking suck. They dress cool, though. They got great fits.
That's really why Godzilla was upset. Just like, no one makes that in my size!